In fact, the governor has appointed a task force to evaluate water policy in New Mexico and to identify what are referred to as actionable recommendations. And we are privileged today to have one of the members of that task force with us to speak. Aron Balok grew up not too far from where I am, near Fence Lake, New Mexico. He graduated from Ramah High School. He graduated from New Mexico State in 1997 with a Bachelor of Science degree in Ag Extension and Education. Today, he is the superintendent of the Pecos Valley Artesian Conservancy District. Not sure how he got there from Fence Lake, but he's been with the district for about 13 years. He also serves on the Interstate Stream Commission. He has a passion for New Mexico's heritage and a deep appreciation for the complexity of the water issues that face the state. He's been professionally involved in water-related issues for the past 16 years. He and his wife, Haley, and one of their 3 daughters live in Roswell, and their older daughters are students at New Mexico State in Las Cruces. I am delighted that we have someone here to talk to us today about what can New Mexico actually do with the studies that it's commissioned. Aron?
Thank you for that introduction. Thank you for having me here today. As mentioned, my name is Aron Balok, and I work for the Pecos Valley Artesian Conservancy District. So I have to offer my disclaimer that the opinions offered here today are mine and mine alone, and not those of the Conservancy District. So where to begin? I'm often reminded the words of Baxter Black when he said, "In feast or famine, at least examine the game we came to play. Because win or lose, it's how we choose the cards that come our way." So we're going to be talking about, with the backdrop of this bleak future that we could be looking at, what can actually be done. And before I get into that, and I don't say this to discredit these models, but I know a lot of us look at those models and think, that's just too sketchy. And there's some truth to that, because models are tricky. And just in the interest of fun, I'm going to reference John Shoemaker, who has made a career out of modeling groundwater, but he had a really interesting take on kind of poking fun at himself. And I snapped a picture of his slide at a conference I was at, and if I can find it here real quick, I know I'm getting close, there it is. Okay, this is what John Shoemaker had to say about models. He said, "We can calibrate a model by adjusting it until it will replicate everything we know about what happened in the past. Water levels, discharges, etc. Bear in mind, these are groundwater models. We then assume that we can predict the future, but we really don't know that much about what happened in the past. It's like reconstructing a piano based on the sound it makes as it rolls down the stairs." There's a lot of error in the models, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't look at the models and listen to what the models have to tell us. And I have made peace with this, because I look at it from the perspective, if those models are correct and we do nothing, we're going to be in a world of hurt. As things get hotter and drier, we've got real problems. So, quick survey here. Who here knows what prior appropriation doctrine is? Raise your hand if you know what that means. Okay, some of us. Prior appropriation doctrine is how we manage water in the state of New Mexico. It's a simple concept that gets really complicated when it's applied. But it is the concept that the first water right user, the most senior, has the better right. And everyone that is junior to that senior is going to have to curtail their withdrawals if the senior isn't getting all of his water. And it's elegant in its simplicity. I tell people all the time, prior appropriation doctrine for water management is like abstinence for birth control. It's 100% effective every time it's implemented. But we don't like prior appropriation doctrine because there's somebody that's going to have to go without. And my argument to that is it is that harshness that makes change possible. So I come from an Artesian groundwater district where I'm out of Roswell. We are the only Artesian groundwater district in the state, and that district has done a pretty good job of managing the groundwater. And it hasn't been easy, and there was a lot of really intelligent design went into getting us to where we're at today, and it's constantly evolving, and we're constantly having to adapt to the circumstances. But because we are faced with the possibility of having a strict priority call, that is the method used to curtail those senior users, my board has taken steps to try and avoid a priority call. That's the beauty of prior appropriation doctrine. So as we look at this here, if you see a term like shortage sharing, don't throw your hackles up and think that means they're going to come take a senior water right from you. This is all against the backdrop of prior appropriation doctrine. So I have zero instruction on how to operate this, so I'm going to start pushing buttons. There we go. Armed with the information that comes out of models like we looked at for the climate change precipitation models and a 50-year water plan, the governor appointed or authorized the appointment, or however you'd like to phrase it, the state engineer to put together this water task force that I served on. And it was with the backdrop of what do we do when all of these things happen? Are we just going to go through and make the juniors curtail to make available for the seniors? It's going to be painful. So maybe there's some things we can do. We all know about the catastrophic wildfires. We know that our aquifer levels are declining. Full disclaimer here, I get a little weird when I hear terms like sustainable, particularly when it goes to groundwater. Some of our groundwater aquifers are not sustainable, no matter how you slice it. Where I grew up, our headquarters well was 900 feet deep and made about 3 gallons a minute. I promise none of us are going to live long enough to see any recharge happening to that aquifer. It's just not going to happen. So we are depleting, we are mining some of our groundwater. That is just a fact. So then you have to decide when is a good time to run out of water for these areas. And if you don't like that perspective, then we need to be thinking about what we can do to prevent that, to avoid that. Okay, in light of this bleak possible future that we're looking at, this task force was convened to try and come up with some actionable items. As you all know, there's a lot of federal funding that is flowing to the state. This was an opportunity to take advantage of some of that cash inflow to the state of New Mexico, match those dollars, and because the state of New Mexico, this is one of those rare times when we're pretty flush, set aside some of that money to do future activities that'll help us better manage water. It's a good little chart here of the considerations that went into it. We do have, and bear in mind when we're talking about water, we're not just talking about water on rangeland, we're not just talking about water in canals for irrigation. This is all facets, and one of those that quickly rose to the surface was, no pun intended, was the municipal water supplies. Because a lot of these small rural villages are in pretty bad shape as far as their infrastructure. Unfortunately, a lot of them set their fee rate up based on what operation costs were, but didn't consider replacement costs on down the road. So you've got 50 to 75-year-old infrastructure and no means of replacing it. And so now a lot of those small communities are looking at how do we go back and fix all of this without raising the rates to the point where no one can afford it. So the state is trying to take that into consideration. As I mentioned, the 50-year water plan, we've got this bleak future outlook for drought. Our water management policy, I mentioned the prior appropriation doctrine. I have to spend a minute to explain here. Under the prior appropriation doctrine, you put water to beneficial use. At some point, a judge needs to look at all of the claims for beneficial use and reconcile that with the supply. That process is called an adjudication process. I think it's a clever play on words, but in my district, we're for all intents and purposes adjudicated. And this is where the play on words comes in, because during an adjudication, the water right owner is considered the defendant. And essentially, previous generations of that area told the state engineer, if you don't sue us, we're going to sue you, because we want to be adjudicated. We want to know who has a claim and how much that claim is. We went through some real growing pains. We have meters on every single point of diversion that has a water right attached to it. The PVACD pays for all of those meters. We pay for the water master to read those meters and do the administration of those water rights. So in a lot of ways, we're ahead of the curve. So our approach here was to get a group of people together that had a background in water management and come up with some ideas on how we can better prepare for the future. The state engineer was the chair of this task force. We also had a lot of participation from the Deputy Secretary of the New Mexico Environmental Department. We had, of course, the ISC there. I can't quite read the next one there. We got all these groups together. The Thornburg Foundation was played an active role in that there in facilitating these. I'll take a minute to express some frustration with the process. When you get a group of people together, I'm often reminded that none of us are as dumb as all of us. And so it's really tough to not fall into that groupthink mentality where pretty soon nonsensical ideas are getting the same consideration as good ideas. But I think they did a really good job of fleshing out some of those. And to my point, there was a particular individual at a completely unrelated meeting that I attended whose solution to our water shortage problem was to train water from the Mississippi, put it in train cars and haul it out west. And I'm not bringing that up to just to make fun of that person. He thought this was a legitimate idea because from his perspective, lack of water meant not having enough water to drink or bathe. And in that context, there's some validity to that solution. But as all of you know, if you've ever had to haul water for livestock, that's a rough way to try and do things. You have to figure something else out. So that's certainly not going to help us with our irrigation problems. So phase one was to get all these groups together. We broke into smaller groups, and I was a participant of the work group 3, which was, we had the simple task of coming up with recommendations for rivers, aquifers, and watersheds. And so it was really difficult to find things that we could agree on. Everybody's coming at this from a different angle. Everybody has their own priorities that they want to see moved forward. Again, I went back to my personal experience with the district. The PVACD has done a great job of managing that aquifer. It's not just because they were so good at what they did. We've got a tremendous resource there. It's a rapidly recharging system, so we can take advantage of these inflows. And that's something else I want to point out. When these weather models are talking about what our future weather patterns may be, I always take a little bit of exception to that just because of the area of the state I'm in. When we talk about a normal weather pattern, what in the world is a normal weather pattern for southeastern New Mexico? Normal is a setting on your washing machine. It has nothing to do with the weather because our weather comes in these big flashy events, long periods of drought followed by intense inflows. We saw those in 2013, we saw them again in 2014. Tremendous amount of water that was able to escape, and in my mind, any water that we don't capture is wasted. It's the philosophy, any water that makes it to the ocean is wasted. So we have to do a better job of containing that water. Does anybody know what the single largest use of water in the state of New Mexico is? I'll give you a hint. 60% of our water goes towards this alone. I heard someone say agriculture. Would it surprise you to hear that that's not it? It's obvious when you hear it. It's evaporation. 60% of our water is lost to evaporation. Because in New Mexico, we have this ridiculous idea that we're going to store water in a reservoir called Brantley that is both shallow and large. And so we end up with a lot of surface area and warm water and 30-mile-an-hour winds and 110-degree temperatures. And it's hard to believe that that's where we chose to put a reservoir. Fortunately, we do have the aquifer system that we have, and a lot of that water is stored underground. And in the long term, that's what I'd like to see New Mexico doing, is doing a better job of encouraging that infiltration so that we can keep that water instead of losing it to evaporation. Okay, this is just a little bit more about the activities of the task force. We tried to reach consensus on the areas where we could. And all of this was from a standpoint, and this is hard for me to back out of it enough to see what the goal is, but the goal is, what can the state do? What can our legislature do to lay a foundation for a better future as far as our water supply goes? So these groups have all met as small groups, and then the big groups have come back together, and we've all looked at the recommendations of others, and we gave our 2 cents on whether or not we like those. To date, I don't have any specific pieces of legislation that are being forwarded. Trust me, there's going to be a lot, and there's going to be some huge asks as far as money to try and accomplish some of these goals. Again, water infrastructure projects are one of those that the state needs to consider. We saw some of that on the news during some of our drought seasons in the recent years, where small municipalities were relying on a single well, or as we call it, a point of diversion, and that well went down. It collapsed. And so that whole community is now out of water, and they're scrambling trying to come up with a replacement well. These are the kind of things that everyone can agree we should have seen coming. If your only source of water is from one well, maybe you ought to be thinking about having a backup well for when that very thing happens. So helping them build out that infrastructure is important. You're going to hear a lot about regional water plans. I don't know if any of you participated in the previous go-around with regional water plans. I had a lot of frustration with the regional water plans because we were planning for the sake of planning. This was a plan whose objective was to come up with a plan, and that, to me, that's nonsensical. You need to set a goal and then come up with a plan to achieve the goal. And I think that's the direction we're trying to go in now with this concept of warmer, drier future. What can we do realistically? What can we do to meet those problems? There's a lot of, another word that I hate is wordsmithing. That seems to me very nonsensical, but that's the best way I know to mention some of the verbiage that was used. How can we make changes to facilitate these problems? How can we come up with better water plans? As I mentioned, maybe we need to have goals for those water plans, and then those plans help us meet those goals. State funding, and I'll spend a minute preaching on that because this is one that I do believe in. We rely, in my little corner of the world, we call it the D2 office. The District 2 State Engineer's Office is the most active state engineer's office in the state. Applications are moving through there all of the time. There's a lot of water being transferred from one location to another, a large amount of oil field activity, a lot of agriculture over there. There's about 110,000 irrigated acres in the valley there, and that water is constantly in motion. That water is what drives the economy. The state engineer does not have the resources to do some of the things that I think needs to be a priority. One of those things I mentioned was adjudication. How can we get a handle on what we're doing if the state engineer hasn't gone through that painful and long and expensive process? He's going to have to come up with something else in the interim, and that's where you'll hear AWRM, Active Water Resource Management, being rolled out. Follows the principle of prior appropriation doctrine, but it's still not the same. And I'm a big advocate for let's push adjudication. I don't know that we'll ever see that. But what else can we do? Well, one of those things is to make resources available so that when we get an application from a producer to transfer water so that he can make it through an irrigation season because his primary point of diversion, the well, collapsed, he needs to get water moved in so that he can pump water and finish out his crop. And he files an emergency application with the state engineer's office, and 6 to 12 months later he gets approval. That's not acceptable. And we find ourselves in the position where everything becomes an emergency, because if he didn't file it under an emergency application, it can take years and years, in fact decades, particularly if it's protested. And that all goes back to the state engineer simply not having the people, the resources to dedicate to getting the job done that we've asked him to do. So I'm a big advocate for funding the state engineer's office. Now, some of our legislature, members of the legislature can explain this much better than I can, but it gets more complicated than that, because not only does the state engineer not have the resources to fill the open positions that he has, he doesn't have the ability to pay those people what they can make elsewhere. And so quite often we find the state engineer employs someone, they learn a skill set through that employment, and then a couple years later, it's a no-brainer for them to go to work in private industry because the salary is that far off. And so the state of New Mexico is going to have to figure that out so that the state engineer can not only hire but can retain competent staff. Okay, this was the one that I was a party to, was the Rivers Aquifers Watershed Health. The Strategic Water Reserve is a program that the state engineer has had for some time. The simplest explanation is, how can we store water to make it available for future use? And for the most part, I think it's not being used. It's being used a little bit, but just not nearly to the degree that it should be. We should have more water being held in storage for times when things are tight. The Environment Department has got a big ask there as far as their Water Quality Bureau goes. And as bad as I hate to agree that we need to give more money to the Environment Department, I think that's necessary, because right now they're doing river monitoring at a rate of about once every 10 years. How can we hope to understand what's going on with our water quality if we're only measuring it every 10 years? It's not realistic to say that that's adequate for that data to be doing us any good. I'm not really sure what they're talking about when they talk about making changes to our groundwater management other than domestic wells. Domestic wells is an issue all the way across the state. And here's why. In my area, I told you I've got a meter on every single point of diversion there. My house operates off of a domestic well, and I promise you, my house is not having a negative impact on the aquifer. But me and 20,000 of my closest friends are probably having a measurable impact on the aquifer. So we need to come up with a way, and because it's in our Constitution that you cannot be denied access to water, it's ticklish. And for me, it's real simple. This needs to be a regional solution, which leads me to my next point. One of the things that I think could come out of this is the state facilitating the formation of groundwater management districts. Again, using my experience as the template, I serve at the pleasure of a 5-member board of directors. If you like what I say here today, go talk to them and pass the attaboy along. If you don't like it, come talk to me and complain. But these are all people that are actively engaged in that community. They understand the problems that our area is facing, and they're best equipped to take action. We're funded through a ad valorem tax, which means if you own property within the boundaries of the district, you pay taxes that fund the PVACD. Because we're funded that way, we're able to finance groundwater studies to define what our aquifer is and how it reacts to different conditions. These are all things that could be done in other parts of the state. Okay, I think I have just about wrapped up. I left a considerable amount of time here for questions, and I hope I've caused a neuron to fire and you have some questions that I can answer.
What questions for Aron?
So some of this water usage and regulating, did you take into consideration with the legalization of marijuana, how much more demand on these fields in agriculture? I know in California, I worked with the National Guard Counter-Drug Task Force. They had huge problems with stealing water, overuse of water, and they tried to monitor and all that other stuff, but there was a huge problem with water problems. And now I see the fences and everything going up and all these crops coming in. How much did you look at that when you were?
Okay, so the question was, how is the legalization of marijuana going to affect our water equation? For me, it's not a big deal. And that doesn't mean it's not a big deal. But the ones it's a problem for are these municipal supplies. They're going to have a problem enforcing that people, and to me it's a simple solution. You simply tier your rates so that offering you enough water on that municipal supply to operate your house and to flush toilets, take showers, and water your garden isn't expensive. But when you go over that, it becomes really expensive really fast, and you can limit it that way. The problem is when you're using municipal water to grow a crop, that's really expensive water that municipality is having to provide because they've got to clean it to drinking water standards. Everywhere else, going back to the adjudication process, if you want to come down to the Pecos Valley and grow marijuana, no problem. Buy a water right, convert it to a commercial use, go from a 3.5 acre feet per acre diversion to 2.1 or 2.5, and you can grow your crop. And as far as the water equation goes, it's not going to have an impact. But the municipalities are the ones that are going to struggle, particularly those small ones, because they're struggling to meet the demands of the residents there anyway, because they're outgrowing them.
Have the tribes been given a seat at the table, or will they?
Absolutely. The tribes had representation in all of the subgroups of the task force, and so as you well know, the tribes operate independent from the state engineer in a lot of regards. Again, this is one of those problems that I don't wring my hands about a lot, because if we follow prior appropriation doctrine, where did the tribes sit on that allocation? The very top. So to me, that's pretty easy to take into account. They've got the first claim to that. And if the tribe, a particular tribe, finds themselves in a situation where they've got more water than they have demand, well, now they're in a position to negotiate with downstream users to come up with a solution to provide water to them. And that's, to me, that's part of the beauty of how prior appropriation can work.
I just wanted to make a quick statement about marijuana and one other thing too. I'm on the board of our water co-op over the mountains at Intranosa. And Intranosa, what we found with the marijuana folks, and there's a bunch of them out there now, is they come to us wanting to grow marijuana with co-op water. And we did exactly what you're saying about, we have our rate structure, the more water you use, the more you pay. Another thing we've done is when people who want to start a marijuana operation, they have to get a letter from us saying that there is available water for them to do that. And we charge them $2,500 just to do the letter. So that, because so many people want to get into the marijuana business and they really are clueless about how to do it and the water requirements, that kind of cuts about half of them out right there when they start seeing what it's going to cost just to establish that they have enough water to do it. And then finally, one other thing, in the Estancia Valley where I live, we have our basin's over-obligated, probably like every basin in this state. So one of the issues that Torrance County is trying to do is they have a lot of grow operations that are starting up out there, and these guys are getting paid for water rights. In other words, water rights that have not been used for a long time, which is a big problem. Torrance County is trying to and I don't know how successful the county is at this, but in their planning and zoning, they're trying to force people to show they have wet water rights instead of just paper water rights. And there's a significant difference in that. I don't know how that's all going to play out. I'm sure it's going to go to the courts eventually. Our basin is adjudicated, but we still have too much water obligated. Just a couple of comments.
Well, and this, just real quick in response to that, one of the tenets of prior appropriation doctrine is beneficial use. And simply put, if you're not using that water reverts back to the state. And that's one of the most unpopular parts of it, because I hear it all the time. All this use it or lose it is nonsense. What you're describing there is exactly why it could work if it were enforced. Because if you can't put that water to beneficial use, well, then you don't have a water right. And then then you start to realize some parity between water rights and actual water. Okay, I think we got time for one more question. Did I see one? I saw one up in the front. There we go.
We read more frequently now about competition between urban areas and agriculture for water, particularly in Arizona and California. Do you anticipate such conflict and competition in New Mexico, and how might it work out?
That's a great question. The question was the conflict between urban demands and agriculture use. One of these days I'm going to find a cartoonist to draw a picture for me. And it's going to be this giant with agriculture use written on the side of it with a big spigot on the side. He's walking up there with a bucket to fill from that agriculture use. And this is where I'm going to uncharacteristically fall into a little gloom and doom here. We're not going to run out of water. We will always have enough water to drink. We can desal brine water. We can come up with enough water to drink, even to provide for livestock. What we're going to do is we're going to move our use to municipal uses, and this is on a grand scale nationwide, particularly think Southern California. Water is still cheap. When I talked to the director of the municipal use for the village or the city of San Diego, he said he estimates that in the next 20 years, approximately 2% of their water portfolio will be from desal. The rest is going to come from ag use. So we are unintentionally exporting our ability to feed ourselves. And unless we come up with something we can all agree on to come up, and this is another term I hate, but equitably, if we can come up with a way to make it fair where we keep that water in ag use, we can continue to feed ourselves. Otherwise, it's going to go where the market is pulling it, and the market is the municipalities.
Aaron, thank you very much.
Thank you. I've got some handouts that I'll leave on the front desk up here. Just a little one-pager about the Water Task Force and maybe hit some of the things I didn't. Thank you all.
When we were assembling this program, one of our objectives is to put tools in your hands that you can use back on the ranch. So as we enter, we've done some background now about what the situation is and what the state's doing about it. We want you to hear from ranchers, and we want you to hear from people who are actively engaged on the landscape and doing stuff that relates to this situation.